Drywalling is part of the concrete session, and it's a really popular one. It covers quite a bit of skills. To start with, you need to lay out where the students are going to cut out their drywall pieces. So make sure that the orientation of the studs is correct. And I've got several templates that you can use for laying out where the students cut their drywall pieces. It's very important to make them nice and square and uniform. That way when the students cut their piece out, we can reuse the holes that they create in future times where they actually put their cut pieces in there as a repair and a patch. So when the students come in and they are going to be just wanting to do the hands-on portion of it, the layout should all be done prior to the students coming here. So that's why I like to lay out and do the work flat on the floor, because it's much more difficult when it's in the vertical position. So this is prior to putting the drywall units together. But laying it out with pencil, and there will be 5 in a row, 5 squares they would cut out. And this is convenient because the students travel in groups of up to 5. So that means that each row would be equivalent to 5 students cutting out their pieces. And there's actually 3 rows, because typically we do have 3 different groups doing the drywall in one day. So that means that one panel would work nicely if you had a full complement of 15 students in 3 different groups. So once it's all laid out with as a grid pattern, then you actually shade in the area that you want the students to cut out. It's important that you visualize and understand which parts are being cut out and which aren't, and why they're not being cut out. You can see where the screw holes are. That's where the studs are traveling vertically on this, and you don't want to cut across a stud because it's really difficult to get the saw across there. The same thing would happen if you're actually doing drywall in your house. Wouldn't want to, well, you try not to have to go across the stud. So once it's laid out, then you want to put the units together in a V form. This allows them to stand up. So just get a small little block, 2x4, pre-start a couple of 2.5 inch screws, and just drive them in, and that locks the top together. Now it's not very secure, but it is secure enough that the parts are not going to fall over. And you'll probably want to set several of these up around the room. Then you get your tote that has all of your tools, your drywalling tools. Remember, at the end of the session, expect everything to be cleaned and tidy and organized and put back in their totes so that the next leader can use them. But there's a couple of hole saws. We've got drywalling trowels, a couple different sizes. You might need a Phillips or a Robertson screwdriver, so it's handy to just have those around. And then one of the DeWalt cordless drills. And that will be set up with a Phillips bit, because in drywall we use Phillips screws. They don't lock onto the driver bit very well. And you have a little tote of drywall screws. They can be reused as long as you keep them clean and try to keep the mud out of the grooves. So you would demonstrate to the students and show them how to push the saw, and it's got like a bit of a knife point on the tip of it, and you just plunge it through the drywall, cut right on the lines. You want to tell the students it's very important they cut right on the lines, not zigzagging around. And that's because when the person cuts out their piece, it's got to fill in the hole from somebody else who cut theirs out. So we're actually working a bit as a team, even though the person who cut it out was probably from a previous session. So the part just falls out, and if they do a nice job, they're relatively straight. Now we need to, as the leader, you need to put some backing in behind, because the drywall needs to be secured to something that's solid. And so we've got some 1x6 rough fur, and you're going to start a screw into it with the cordless drill, and that will anchor it in place. I'm just showing you what this is what it looks like inside the walls of a house. This lots of times when you're doing construction you can actually see this, but once a house is built, all you see is the finished drywall. So we need to have some kind of backing, so we've just anchored one screw in the top of it. Now we're going to finish putting it together, and you can see we're driving the screws in. When you drive the screws in, there's actually a couple of settings on the cordless drill that allow the screw to regulate how deep that it is sunk. lots of times the students will drive the screw too deep. So make sure that you get the setting correct on the cordless drill prior, and show the students how to do this. It's nice for the students to understand how to use the tools. Sometimes they don't quite fit right, and so I've got a nice little rasp or a file that you can have the students clean up the edges a bit so that they fit a little bit nicer. And this happens from time to time. Try to make sure that the paper stays on the drywall, and drywall is crumbly, so be very careful with it. Now we're just going to use the students are going to use the cordless drill to drive in 2 screws. Don't have them too close to the edges, otherwise they will chip out the drywall. And you want them to make sure that they countersink them so that they are a little bit a little bit below flush on the drywall. But I like them to use 2 screws. And this is the same in a house, is that you need to countersink these a bit so they actually are below the surface of the drywall, because you want to put some mud over top. If you don't put a thick enough layer of mud over top of any cracks or screws, then you'll get cracks showing. Now we're not going to use any tape on this. Lots of times you would also use a tape to fill in the cracks. We're just going to strictly mud it because the students are pretty busy after doing concrete and then also having to do the drywall and painting. So just put the amount of drywall mud into the trough that you're going to be using. And it never goes back into the original bucket. What we try to do is try to reduce any little chunks or foreign materials in there, because it's really hard to trowel out the drywall when you've got even just little bits of dirt or even old dried chunks of drywall mud. It leaves streaks in your drywall. So anytime you can do a better finish with your drywall in the mudding portion means less sanding. Now we're not going to do any sanding in this session because it gets really dusty. So the idea is to teach the kids how to fill in all the holes, all the cracks, put on a good layer of mud. So that means you have to build it up, and that's hard because it wants to spread right off. So it's a little bit of practice and technique to build up to a thick layer of mud, and that's over all of the cracks and where the drywall screws are. And we just want them to do their section. And so then they take a larger trowel after, and that's to smooth it out. And you can explain to the students that the first bit of mudding you put on is really just roughing it out, and then they would have to let it dry for the day, and then they would sand it, and then the next day they would trowel on another coat, and the day after that sand it. And this is repeated until you have a finish that nobody can see the difference that you've put in this patch. So it's quite a valuable skill to learn.